Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Oaktree Institute podcast. We're really excited and happy to have a really amazing guest today, Imam Khalid Latif from New York University, the Islamic Center of New York University, a dedicated servant of the community for many, many years. Alhamdulillah, a public speaker and a main figure in the Muslim community across the nation. Very excited to have you, Imam Khalid. Barakallah feek.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Truly our pleasure, and I know it's crazy times and definitely weird times. Particularly, I know y'all just started your semester at the IC, and the unique style of the ways that y'all are doing your programs this year. How are things going? How are things going with you and the work at ICNYU and everything?
Yeah, man, alhamdulillah. You picked up a y'all in your talk, by the way, from maybe your time in Dallas. I know you didn't get that from New York City when you lived out here.
Definitely picked that up in Dallas. It is more inclusive, in saying and using, but yeah, definitely a Southern twist on the you all.
Yeah.
How are you all doing?
Things are good, alhamdulillah. We're dealing with a lot the way many people in the country are. New York City was a really tough place to be in, especially going into April and May. If you come here now and you had been here then, it's like two different worlds. There's still so much that's taking place, though. The consequences of a lot of poor policy governmentally, people still without health care, no jobs. Businesses are closing everywhere. Rent is coming to be due. There's a lot of opportunity to really help a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And I think trickling it down to the individual experience, you see people have adapted, but at the same time, there's still a concern and I think a real longing to understand, well, when will this come to pass and how is it that we can ensure that we're doing right now what we can as a community to preemptively meet people's needs that we know will be forthcoming down the line, inshallah.
Yeah, I love that thought. So I guess maybe we'll dive right into that. You brought it up really well. How have you, leading the Islamic Center at NYU, how are you thinking about, how you're trying to serve the community nowadays? Like, I know everybody's going through this challenge, and I think you've probably seen this, I've seen this as well, is people are struggling in how to figure this out, right? How do we create the brotherhood and sisterhood? How do we make sure we're caring and connecting with people? Like, it's such a weird time. So how are you all navigating that? Like, what are you doing with the team, and how are you trying to navigate that with your leadership at NYU?
At the onset of COVID, if we use that as kind of the catalyst for a lot of this, we had immediately shifted to a virtual program that allowed for us to engage our community more broadly. I think what I was seeing was a lot of religious communities, not just Muslim community, but, churches, synagogues, temples. There's a lot of media taking place, and myself, members of our staff, we were participating. There were so many people who were associated with religious communities that their talking points were all about how certain things couldn't happen. You couldn't attend congregational prayers or you couldn't go to certain services, but the focus is on, what's not there. And right from the beginning, I had people in our community in New York City, people from different parts of the country reach out saying, my father lost his job. I've lost my job. I don't know how we're going to pay our rent. We don't have health care. Like, how can we not go to work even though this virus is out there? We only get paid if we do go to work. And so the approach that we sought to take was to see what we could do to remedy the situation, to try to be adaptable as an institution so that individuals could still meet what they were meeting in whatever space they were in, but we could create a broader space of engagement that allowed for them to still participate and have needs met within the circumstances that we found ourselves in. So we launched a series of like fundraising campaigns to help people who were financially impacted. Our first one, we raised funds with Penny Appeal USA and Celebrate Mercy. It was a national fund that I think hit about $650,000 in like a week or so. And we were just sending micro grants, rapid response to people who were in need. We had a team of caseworkers that were looking at applications, and we're giving people anywhere from $500 to $2,500 because people had no money. And this was when the government was still trying to figure out stimulus packages. We then started to see like a lot of illness and ailment in New York City, and the funeral homes were really overwhelmed. So we had a fund that we launched that in 2 days raised about, I think, $200,000, in addition to some other funds that have been launched doing similar work to help increase capacity, buy vehicles, ensure that there was proper burial. Because people are doing some sick things, man. Like we had, a typical funeral would cost $1,500 to $2,000, give or take, with all the janazah procedures, the burial ground purchase. And there was people who were coming to us who already don't have any money, and they've now lost their job and their source of income. And they're saying, we're being told we are going to be charged $8,000, $10,000, like a, surge in pricing to take advantage of people in a moment of need. And these are people, many of them, because of the restrictions, they wouldn't have even been able to likely see their loved one in their last hours of life because they couldn't go into the hospital, let alone not go to the janazah prayer itself. There's already like a lot of isolation and loneliness that's there. And then we raised some more funds going into Ramadan. One was for New Yorkers in specific, where we raised almost $1 million to give these rapid cash grants to people, because the $1,200 stimulus check wasn't really going to work in New York City for people. And then we had another one that was for survivors of domestic violence, where in COVID, there was an uptick in the amount of abuse that was taking place. People were now confined with their abusers. Altogether, in a few months, alhamdulillah, we raised about $2.5 million as a university-based Muslim institution. But it wasn't like one person giving $1 million check. We probably had like 40,000 donors, contributing to these things. Everybody felt like the dollar they gave, the $10 they gave, could all make a difference as a collective, only through their individual participation. And I think it helps people to feel as if they're involved and still able to be a part of like a healing process. And then we tapped into our community's talents and resources. So it wasn't just our staff, myself, Sheikh Sahib Webb, Sheikh Aisha Prime, Sheikh Faz Jafar doing programs, but we said, who can present on anything? And so people were presenting on, workshops on how to write a resume, how to financially invest, how to create a website. Artists were doing, art workshops as a means of healing. We had people doing children's story time, yoga, for sisters during lunch hours, things across the board that catered to the diversity of our programming. And as we went through the summer, adapting it to Ramadan, to other things, and letting people still feel as if they had an access point through a model that had multiple entry points to it that still met them where they were, rather than kind of saying, here's the only kind of way that you could do it.
I truly love that, and may Allah bless you and reward you. I mean, I saw some of those campaigns, particularly the ones around domestic violence, the ones around the burial, the Islamic burial situation in New York got, subhanAllah, very, very difficult. I know we know some of the organizations that do some work there. It's so amazing how y'all are so thoughtful about so many different segments of the community you serve. I mean, I think people don't know, like, you don't really actually serve just NYU. You're really serving almost all of Lower Manhattan, almost in a sense, right? Because really, like, there's not a lot of dynamic organizations doing, the community work needed there. So how do you maybe like as like if I were to pick your mind a little bit, if you don't mind, how do you develop programming that's so intentional at ICNYU? Like y'all are always really thinking about different demographics, how you serve them, leveraging people, leveraging resources to them. How did you come to that? I know you've been doing this for so many years, but why is that like a drive for y'all and with your leadership as an organization?
Well, I mean, when you have access to like talent, I mean, what becomes the reason as to why you wouldn't engage that talent? And so much of our spiritual tradition outlines at a foundational level things that we wrestle against day to day. You have to wrestle against like your nafs, right? Ego is like a very real thing, and it's not in a vacuum. We live in a society that has this modern day shirk, that supremacy, that idolizes the self. It doesn't know how to deal with mortality. It, says the primordial state of existence is one that is rooted in egocentricity. It's very different from what our religion calls towards. But when you're now in a space where you can recognize with confidence and gratitude, alhamdulillah, like strengths that Allah has endowed you with, as well as non-strengths, areas of improvement, and there's gaps that are there, you bring in people and you empower them through what it is that they inherently are good at, and let them feel connected to their creator through that, right? The Prophet ﷺ, like his unique person was such that he could see what was good in the people around him and let them then see that also. And people are like so creative, man. They're so innovative. I think we tend to like think in negative frames, and that's just a product of human condition. Statistically, people think anywhere from 12,000 to 60,000, 70,000 thoughts a day. Like, this better than I do, given things that you've studied and things, and our thoughts tend to exist, 80% of them in like negative thoughts. We're like inclined towards seeing through a prism, and then those get compounded because, 95% of our thoughts are repeat thoughts. Like we think, and then we think it negatively over and over and over. And so you see Muslims kind of defining things in terms of what's lacking, what's inadequate, and you have like so much that's right there in front of you that you don't have to go and look for it elsewhere. And I feel like being able to then leverage that in a way that bleeds into like other projects and programs, it just makes sense to do at the end of the day. We serve, a student-based community, like you were saying. There's about 3,000 Muslim students at NYU, but maybe like 8 years ago, we made an active decision to open our space and programs to people who live and work in the area. So inclusive of faculty and alumni and staff of NYU, but also a lot of people who have no direct affiliation. We estimate we serve about 10,000 people now. And before COVID, that number was growing every year. I don't know like what it would be right now because we don't have a metric of assessment on that at this point. But it's still like a fairly large number, and our reach is there, alhamdulillah. We're trying to ensure that like that healthy, thriving community doesn't adopt like this sense of individualism, or this kind of one-man show syndrome that has institutions run off of people that are present rather than processes, and creating this like professional volunteer base, I think is like a key element of a successful institution.
Yes, I love that. And I love that you brought that up. I think, you go to a lot of places, and I know you travel a lot, and you can go to a lot of MSAs or even chaplains that are, on in large institutions, or, large community centers or masjids that have hundreds of thousands of people, but you don't get that community vibe. I think ICNYU is so unique in that dynamic. So if you could, if we could take a step back, and if you were to look about the journey at, your journey at ICNYU, which started almost over a decade ago, right? You've been at ICNYU for over a decade. I don't think it started off like that, right? Like, how did how did you think about this strategically, and how did you build it? Like, what have you learned throughout the journey of, right now being like, I think one of the top communities. I think it's, people assume that you're student based, but like you mentioned, like y'all serve like such an amazing array of diverse levels of people and members of a community in that lower New York area. What did you learn from that journey in building the IC?
I mean, when I started, I was 22, and I was in 2005. And what I thought it was going to be when I came in was very different from what it actually was. Right from the onset, what I conceptualized as like giving khutbahs and like different like halaqas, it was really clear people just were looking also for a space to self-express and for someone to talk to. And the spectrum of things that people were bringing as lived realities was not something that, I had thought would have been there, especially at that level of prevalence and that level of consistency from unique individuals. I think in my own personal trajectory, alhamdulillah, like I never had a challenge growing up with my religious identity being a cause of marginalization. As I've gotten older, there's been like discrimination issues and things like that. But I didn't go to school with a lot of Muslims growing up. I didn't have a lot of Muslim friends, but I still straddled multiple spheres of my identity. And I think similar to many people's like life journeys, there was a certain sense of like exploration that I just didn't find that yielded a lot of kind of isolation, even where I was surrounded by people. And I think from the onset, like the community ethos was one that I just didn't want anybody to feel like they had to be alone. Institutionally, when I was now trying to figure out, well, what are we doing here? I didn't have like a precedent to build off of because, what I was learning, from the standpoint of religion and spirituality wasn't equipping me to like manage a nonprofit institution or build something from the ground up. There was no precedent to follow in terms of other people that were doing this at that point in time. So I looked at counterpart institutions of different minority communities and centers, and I, for some part of it, just went and sat in their facilities and saw how they functioned, what were the things they were doing, what were the things they weren't doing. I then looked to see what were key partnerships that we could create with institutions on our campus as well as off campus. One thing that I think was a catalyst for a lot of our center's professional institutionalization had to do with space at NYU. And we used to have a facility in a student center that existed called the Loeb Student Center, which every student group had a space that they could use for office space. There was like a food court and a game room. And back then, NYU didn't have that many student clubs. And the Islamic Center, whose institutional memory is rooted in a student group founded in 1978 by 5 Muslim students at NYU, was much smaller. They had a space in that building. Jummah prayers would take place in that room. They'd get like 20, 25 people. We now comparatively have Jummah in 3 locations. Our largest one gets about 800 people. The other get like 50 to 100 consistently. And most people aren't even here on Fridays. But when that building went down and a new building was being constructed, the university built out swing space in the surrounding area. And we were leasing a room as a university in a local church that on its second floor, there was a small space that Muslim students used for prayer. And when the new building went up as a student university center, our assumption was we would just have a space to pray in that room, in that building. And when I went to talk to the university administration about it, as an undergrad at NYU, they said, we didn't even know you existed. And even if we did, historically, we don't support religious community. Now, why this was a challenge was in the 4 years that that building was going up, you had like certain geopolitical realities take place. You know, the September 11th attacks, the Second Intifada, you know, all different kind of things happening. As students, we had like engaged media from all over the world. You know, there was different movements and things. And when I heard this, it made me wonder how it's possible that we were doing all of this, but the very like institution we were part of has never felt our impact, right? And it made me think of like the story of Abu Bakr radiallahu an, where he seeks permission to make hijrah from the Prophet alayhi salam, and then a non-Muslim, noble by the name of Ibn Daghina says to him, like, you can't leave, because if people like you leave, our city will, our people will start to suffer. You bring like benefit to it, essentially, right? Paraphrase. It's a longer story. And he's basically saying that Abu Bakr's presence brings benefit to the community, and his absence is felt as much as his presence. And I said, well, we got to build a community like that it's not just about impacting Muslims, but if we weren't here, everybody would say, like, we can't let these people go. They make us better. And so those strategic collaborations and partnerships built out with like the mental health center, and wellness center, built out with the fundraising and development office, the press office, the various agencies on campus that made sense for us to start to amplify our voice and, ensure that the narrative and perception that we were creating on a branding level made sense. I then also had to yield to the fact that there's just a lot of things I had no idea what I was doing. But I'm at a university that's full of like experts in all kinds of fields. So all I started to do was like reach out to people and say, I have some questions, can I ask you? And they would like entertain me and give me meetings, and I'd ask whatever I want to try to learn things. I started to audit classes and like fundraising, with different senior leadership from the university, which allowed for me to not just learn about things that I'd never studied, but also build relationships with these key individuals who were in leadership positions at the university. Then we started to think out, different ways of marketing and kind of, making decisions like, do we open up our space to people who are not affiliated with NYU? Do we, not open it up? And, implementing a strategy that makes sense. We were this summer supposed to do now a revisioning of the next 10 years that says where we've now grown, alhamdulillah, requires more input from different stakeholders. So what would the next 10 years look like? With COVID, we had to postpone that, and likely we'll push it, inshallah, to next summer. But to say, what are social services we want to build out? What are civic engagement projects? What are different ventures we can engage in to really enhance and leverage what it is that we see as a potential opportunity, and not be content with like where it's at, but build and build and build, so that we're doing what we have the ability to do. And that's just the reason that we want to do it, because like it can be done, and no one's going to build for us, what we have to build for ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, it was wonderful and very insightful in terms of like the process. I don't think people realize, mashallah, I mean, almost going on a decade and a half, like it's so long. It's so long to build a dynamic community that's serving all the different components, right? It's as you mentioned, like it's a huge grind. And mashallah, you've been very persistent and resilient throughout. So you highlighted 3 areas I think I want to note. The first of them was, this eagerness, first and foremost, to identify quickly how you can serve the community and like kind of get a gauge on that. The second was, and repeating some of the key lessons, is you really built bridges, right? You try to connect with so many different partners, and you still do. And those that don't know you from the New York area, you are tremendously connected with government and with organizations and all kinds of different people. And I think that that's really crucial for how you leverage and how you impact the community, as you mentioned, like the story of Abu Bakr, wonderful example. And then the third was that you were very astute, you had the curiosity to go out and try to learn, as you mentioned. And mashallah, I know now you're teaching at the school. So how is that? So from those three things, like what are so these are challenges, as you know, many, many different places, many different communities. They just simply don't get to the point of doing like these basic fundamental things. What have you seen? Like you plowed through that, right? Any of those obstacles. Why do other community leaders within, like, I know you see it at a bigger lens, why is that something that not enough community centers or organizations, why is that something we're not doing enough as a community, as an organization?
I think people are, mashallah, right? I mean, I think there's a value to what has been created over centuries, right? Islam has been here for a long time, right? 30% of slaves that came were Muslim, and the deep legacy of Islam and Black experience in the United States is often neglected, but is present. I think where you have then immigrant experience that has established numerous institutions that then lend towards the development of other institutions. One of the things that I think is a problem is that we identify things too much in terms of problems, and we see things through the prism of challenges and put in our talent to like reacting to challenges, often rhetorically, as opposed to amplifying and highlighting, the successes of certain things, right? Like you have like health clinics that are built throughout the country. You have endowment vehicles that are built throughout the country. You have major relief agencies that are functioning both domestically and internationally. You have individuals who are, leaders at every level, local, state, and national. You can look at things like the Ummah Free Clinic. You can look at Imam on the south side of Chicago. Rami Neshashibi, I think, is an amazing person who encapsulates probably examples of leadership that are remarkable. And it's not that awards and accolades like are what make him who he is, but he was awarded like as a MacArthur Genius. I think 2 years ago. Everything's a blur because of COVID, but there's people that are like that, and I think their stories and their experiences and their best practices are not leveraged because the challenge is that we focus and identify challenges not in the prism of opportunity as something that you can overcome, but as like a stop. We're saying this is where something is a bad or wrong, and we see it then in absolute prisms. We don't highlight stories that are real, that are also of success and gain, and can give people something to aspire towards. I went to Seattle. My wife and I, before our son was born, our daughter was born then, we had gone on a cruise to Alaska from Seattle, and we had a night where we flew in the day before, so our daughter was pretty young, and I'd reached out to some people who had spoken at their communities there, and said, could anybody grab us from the airport? Mashallah, like really beautiful people. They set up like a dinner for us at like their home, and were very welcoming. And over dinner, one of the brothers said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "We are setting up a youth camp that I'd love to get some feedback from you." And I said, "Sure." And he started to tell me what it was about, and all of the topics he wanted to cover were about like the problems with this and the challenges with this and not fitting in and identity issues, but everything was rooted in an issue. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think people are going to be miserable." And he said, "What do you mean?" I was like, "Look, man, I'm sitting with you all here, and you all are like amazing people. Like, I called you to get a ride from the airport to our hotel, and you all went above and beyond. Literally, like one of the sisters that was there, whose house we were in, her and her husband had like hosted us for dinner. She had read on a Facebook post I made like years ago that I was looking for some halal version of Lucky Charms, the cereal, in the Gulf when I was there. And she had made me a box of Lucky Charms by taking halal marshmallows, dyeing them, cutting them out, and putting it in like a box that, resembled this thing. And I was like, this is like, you're going above and beyond. I was like, this is ihsan, right? You like turned a car ride that was 30 minutes into like an entire day and a half of just hospitality. I was like, tell them why you are the way that you are. Give them aspirational examples that are not intangible. The engagement is not one that's beyond accessibility, but most can write off that they're not going to be like the sheikh or the scholar that's on the YouTube video, but they want to be successful as Muslims and work in graphic design and work in finance and entrepreneur. Tell them like what makes you you. Give them stories of encouragement. And he said, we never think about it that way. It's like, well, you're just passing on what was given to you, and you can only give to somebody what you possess in the first place. So if somebody has taught you to look at what's not there and in that negative prism, like if shaitan can get you to do this much good when you have the ability to do this much good, he's going to get you to do this. You might not be doing anything wrong, but he doesn't want to see you benefit. And there's a subtlety to like that perspective and that image. And I think like that's where our tradition affords us so much, because we're then seeing things through core beliefs that we don't even know that we have, that are now making reality what we perceive it to be, because our hearts and our mind don't perceive reality on their own. We tell them what we think is true. And if we think everything's terrible, then we're going to say everything's terrible. But then people will start thinking everything's terrible. And if we can create balance to it, as much as hopelessness is an ailment of the heart, so is excessive hope. Like we can be in a place though where we can still give people encouragement, right? Like you're an amazing person. Like people should be learning from you as to why you do what you do. And you can embrace that within yourself as like, alhamdulillah, like in a time when people are so selfish. Like it's not even that people put themselves ahead of people, but there's nobody even behind them. So it's not that they're first and somebody else is second, or there's no second or third. It's just me and my needs. Like if God endows you with a capacity to want to do for someone else, like that's something to embrace as a ni'mah, and to then say, like, why do I do this? What brings me to it? How do I inculcate within you lessons that allow for you to err on the end of positivity and see that success can be harnessed, and there's things that, and then the other gain from this is that you don't have to start from scratch. The minute you can admit that somebody knows what they're doing and they're doing it well, you take from their best practices and you build upon it and you grow from it, and you start to then see it. And even if it's not contemporarily, which there's no shortage of Muslims that are doing amazing things, especially on localized levels, this is why we have books. This is why we have texts. We like take people's ideas and opinions who have like shared them for our benefit, so we can build upon what's there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I love it. No, I really appreciate the optimism. I think you beautifully articulated that. Like there's, and I know you alluded to it earlier about this hyper focus around all the problems that can be, rather than all the opportunity and growth and amazing blessings and good that we have, either at an individual level or even at a societal level. Like there's so much good that's being done at an ummah level, so much good being done, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And that's tremendously, it shows us a lot about kind of your demeanor, your character, the way you're seeing things, and I think that's so essentially important. Tell us how did Khalid get to being Khalid? Like how did Imam Khalid get here? What was your journey? How was, I think a lot of times, and I really, I'm in community work. You're in community work. We've been doing it for a long time. We see a lot of times like it's difficult to stay in for the long haul. at a career level for sure, but even like in terms of volunteering and being there. What's driven you? Like what's caused you? Maybe a little bit about yourself that caused you to be so motivated to really serve the community in the capacity that you have, and what do you tell others that are, millennials, Gen Z? What are the expectation that they should have coming into community work? The good, I want to be positive, the good and the challenges, and like how they should navigate that if they. I don't think we have enough servant leaders like yourself in our community. I think we need more. Maybe we have some, but I think we always need more. And so tell us a little bit about your journey and what others can learn from that grind of many years of servant leadership.
Yeah, well, I think servant leadership is an important model to understand because you have historically a shift where the leader was in this like service-based mode and wasn't seen as like the top of the chain. And when you move into this more like Machiavellian understanding of leadership that now centers like the CEO, centers, the one person in charge, and they now become a manifestation of ego that's not service-based but is self-serving, they problematize these things. In a God-centric worldview, you can't have like that absence of service-based leadership. I had a teacher who told me early on, that the most successful Muslim communities are the ones that know where like their leaders live, right? And before I got married, I didn't even lock the door to my apartment. People would just come, they'd hang out. One of the things I love about our community is, there is that like sense of accessibility that even with our staff, I tell them like, that's like what makes it and breaks it, that there's not separation between the people we serve and the people who are doing the service. It can be a lot. And, in my own personal journey, I worked at the IC probably for about, I want to say almost 10 years on my own because we fundraise everything that we spend. I'm trying to figure some of these things out. It was tough, to say the least. I think if I wasn't at the phase of life that I was in at that time, it would probably make it a little bit harder in terms of like just not like making any money and, challenges that were there. But no one had taught me self-care also. And I came out of a place where I was coasting. I was supposed to play sports in college. In high school in my senior year, I had an injury that stopped recruiting. But prior to that, I was working out like 3 times a day. I had my own trainer. And so going into now 5-6 years later, when I'm starting to work and I'm getting pulled in different directions and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, my self-care is non-existent, but I'm coasting off of just what I had built of physical wellness. And that started to diminish going into the latter part of my 20s. I was starting to get sick quite often. My weight would fluctuate a lot. I'd get very heavy. I'd get very light. There were some Ramadans where I was losing like crazy weight. I'd lose more than 20 pounds, and I'm not a big guy. By the end of it, I was losing more than a pound a day, and it's not healthy. When I was 28, almost 29, I got a sickness called shingles. And shingles, if you've ever known someone who has it, it's usually like elderly people who get it. If you have the chicken pox, the virus lives in your system. And when you get to a low point of immunity and high level of stress, it reactivates as piercing blisters on a nerve track. And I had it from the middle of my torso to my back. When I went to the doctor said, it's going to feel like somebody is rubbing a hot iron on your body while they're stabbing you with a knife over and over, because it's on your nerves. Even if your clothes move like this, it's enough to erupt your entire body in like painful sensation. I had to go into quarantine. I couldn't be like near my wife, near like our child. I went to my parents' home and stayed there for about 6 weeks. And I remember getting an email from a young sister in our community who had written to me about her Muslim boyfriend that morning, grabbing her in a hallway and taking her and throwing her against a wall. And she said, had a security guard not come and intervened, I don't know what would have happened. And she was now asking for help and assistance, not knowing how to navigate like this experience. And I closed the laptop. I still remember I went downstairs to where my mother was sitting, and I put my head in her lap and I just started to cry. And it wasn't frustrating to me because I didn't know what to do for this young woman, but I couldn't take care of her because I wasn't taking care of me. And that burnout and exhaustion was in a place where I had another teacher who, said to me when I was getting into this work, that, you're made for this, but just be ready. It's going to be super lonely. And I said, what does that even mean? But this idea of this burdensome responsibility that I have to be there for others. I can't let them be there for me, not having deep relationships, not taking time for myself, my own self-development, my physical, emotional, mental, spiritual wellness. Those things can all add up and they can be really, really tough. And the elasticity of time, is something that we don't recognize fully. And so there's always excuses as to why you don't do it, but then it catches up to you. And, subhanAllah, your body, your emotions, like they're data points, right? Like emotions are not good or bad things. Your reactions to them, are indicative and can be good or bad, but it's telling you something, right? The way your stomach tells you it's hungry, your throat's going to tell you it's thirsty. Like your demeanor, your emotions, your body, it's going to tell you if you're doing right by it or not. And there's a long period of time that I wasn't doing right by it, and I had to learn like the hard way and to understand how does that like fit into the rest of this. That perspective is going to be then defined through a vision modifier that is this exhaustion, this tiredness. You're going to see what is potential and possible and what you believe can be malleable or change what you aspire towards, not based off of what's going on outside of you, but in large part what's going on within you. And if in you have exhaustion and bitterness and animosity and irreconciled emotion and pain, then like why wouldn't the world look like everything's terrible? And there's terrible things happening, but the idea isn't to say everything is fine and dandy. The idea is to say, how do I become like a remedy of what's there? And if I can't, like, how do I bring in other people to help if that's within my capacity? But the exhaustion says nothing can change. Like, it's not possible. There's no use in even trying. Or it creates immediate need for gratification that says, we got to do this right now. It has to happen tonight. Versus, no, like, this can be taken care of in a week, in a month. You sit down, you plan, you strategize. We just, alhamdulillah, last week closed on a building that's going to be a domestic violence shelter in New York, emergency confidential shelter for women and children who are survivors of abuse. The work that I do, I haven't gone like a week, in the last 15 years where at least one woman, if not upwards of a dozen, have reached out with men in their life who have no idea what it means to be a man. And the resources, the services we want to provide are not just individual, but institutional. Prior to COVID, we had like a fundraising campaign, a nonprofit we started, and with the government shutdown last November and other stuff with COVID, there were slowdowns. But alhamdulillah, we were able to acquire this space that, has a lot of amazing potential. It's the first in a series of these services. And when members of our community came to me and alums and others saying, we want to do this, it was like a 2-year process before we even executed. I said, great, here's things I can help you with. Like, we got to figure out what we need to do. 6 months, we like brainstormed on paper. And after that, we did a call for volunteers and others to fill gaps on skills and credentials and training that we just didn't have. We then built out a team. And then about a year later, we then started to announce things to the community more broadly, try to have a fundraising campaign for the first project in this series of services. And so we're now about a year and a half out from the first conversation, and it's just been planning and execution at that point. We thought it would take us 6 months to a year to raise $700,000 to renovate and acquire a building. And in a week and a half, we raised over $1 million from 9,000 donors, because its execution was rooted in like strategy. And, you know, there's, I think, barakah in it when you're in these places of like good beginnings and good intentions. And it's hard to do that when you're tired, right? To stay like motivated and have momentum that builds off of like the vision rather than like immediate gratification, like fueling you. And then again, you're doing like good like this when you have the capacity to do it this way. And so I tell people, like, you can't take care of other people's hearts if you're not taking care of your own. You gotta sleep well, eat well, make sure your physical wellness, your emotional wellness, your mental wellness, spiritual wellness, you know, is something that's there, and you have evolution to yourself, right? I got 2 kids now, alhamdulillah, that I love more than anything. My son wakes up, man, like at 5 in the morning sometimes. Fajr time is not like what it used to be. He's 5 years old. He jumps on my face 5:30 in the morning. He whispers, "Baba, it's me." I'm like, "Thanks, Kareem." I thought some other man was like in my bed all of a sudden. And, you know, he wants to pray with us. He wants to jump around. I can get frustrated and get angry at a 5-year-old for being 5, or he's 5. And I can just understand that in the evolution of my own self, I don't ever want to forego being a father or learning what I can only learn from my children in terms of my own development. So I have to say, it's not that this will never happen, but maybe where I find like solitude or silence that was in New York City at a time when nobody's up at 5, 6 in the morning on the street, and it's beautiful going to the masjid for Fajr, I like turn that now into a later part of the day, you know, and I can still gain because there's change and adaptation, right? And this is a hadith, the believer's state, you know, the Prophet ﷺ defines, we change 40 times in a day. The one who has no belief is the same for 40 years in a row. That's what you see when I get resumes from people all the time, 10 years experience, 20 years experience, 30 years experience. And I'm like, no, man, you just lived the same year over and over again, like 30 times. You're not taking like change as a necessary component to like your own contentment. And if you're not feeling good inside, you feel terrible inside, then that's what things are going to look like for you when you're trying to figure out how to do things as an activist or a, you know, community leader or whatever other role you're in, you know?
I love that. I really appreciate that. First and foremost, I appreciate the vulnerability and the really honest kind of perspective, like the real challenges that we go through physically, emotionally, as you mentioned, even spiritually. And then, yeah, that self-care piece is so important, that particularly when, you're always giving to others, whether you're an imam or you're whatever capacity can be, subhanAllah, you know, so many people are always very, you know, we have tremendously selfless people that are always giving to others, and that sometimes, they don't get the time to refuel and re-energize. And it's a great point about just loving family, being there, you know, working on yourself. And I really appreciate you sharing that. I think those are really important lessons for a lot of people that are going to be hearing this. And I think that level of vulnerability you shared is very relevant and very hopefully impactful for people that will learn from that. I like to end like I usually our sessions, and I know like we're just a couple of minutes or so. What is I like to always ask every guest we bring on, what is the you know, kind of like the, and maybe you can allude to something you already mentioned, but if you had like a khutbah and you spoke to, you know, all the leaders, you know, at least within our community, in our country, like if you had a khutbah in front of all the Muslim leaders in our community, what's the one message you want to deliver to all? Like, what's the one thing you would want, or one piece of advice or one lesson that you wish our leaders implemented or instituted, or, you know, some advice that you can give them if you had that opportunity?
I mean, so many things don't really come to mind, to be honest. I think like the few thoughts that do come to mind, I mean, one, I would say thank you to people. I think it can be a very thankless job. And I don't think like we appreciate our leaders as much as they could be appreciated, and it's hard. Everyone needs validation, and as much as we need people to look up to, sometimes we also need to be looked up to in a way where we feel affirmed. And you could be the most impactful person in the world if somebody's not telling you that they're grateful for you or that they love you. It becomes that much harder to do what you're doing, and can become very isolating. The other thing that I would say is they should take care of themselves, as we already talked about a bit. And third, I would say, to ensure that we remember, like, we're helping people to know who God is to them. And I think it's important to let people know that they can believe in a God that also believes in them, and to help them see like what Allah sees in us, right? Because you read the Quran, you read the Hadith, I remember like reading about the Prophet ﷺ and companions in such a way where in my own like spiritual journey and exploration, like I said to myself, like, I want to believe in the God that he believes in, that lets him like meet the world in the way that he does. And that's not the God that like I believe in from what I'm hearing from different people and on the minbar and other things. And it doesn't have to be watered down or anything, but like, how does he have like courage and like boldness and strength and like doesn't stop? Like you're saying, how do you keep going? 23 years this man doesn't stop. And it's not that he just does his work and his mission. He's still smiling at people. Like he's still kind to people. He still embodies like mercy. And that core belief that he has is not just rotely memorized like books of theology. He like very clearly, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, believes in a God that is not just simply watching him, but watching over him. They can have him meet challenges and still define like himself in these positive values and virtues. And we don't want to take God away from people. We want to kind of stay in our lane, know that we don't speak on behalf of God, but people will still shape their understanding of who the divine is based off of our interactions, our demeanor, the words that we choose to use and not to use. And it's a very important like thing. And I think ensuring that we complement the legalistic framework of our tradition with the ethical framework, giving people a sense of ideals and values that isn't like go find your purpose. The Quran tells us like what our purpose is, and it's not just worshiping God. That's one thing, but it says so many other things about why we were made and why we were created. But everything goes back to Allah in our tradition. And if we can give people a sense of choosing to believe in a God that believes in them, like this is a time to do that so that they're not confined to this world in the sense that they see it as an ends but a means to something. They're able to then just go try their best. And that would be the last thing I would say, is that you got to have like self-love and self-forgiveness so that you can accept mistakes that come from you as well as celebrate successes. And so you want to be in a place where you're also like cultivating your relationship with Allah, and being able to admit and acknowledge where there's room for growth and development, and not in like a burdensome way, but in a way that's liberating. Because people ask me like all the time, man, like, what do you think about what's going on? And I just, sometimes I want to be like, I'm so grateful that I have Islam, and I have, a belief that's not someone else's belief, but a belief that's in here, that there's something that comes after this, and there's a place that, things will be made sense of. And I just got to do what, I can do so that when I stand in front of my creator, my 90-year-old self, if I get to that point, what am I doing now so that when my 90-year-old self looks back at me today, they'll be able to thank me for the things that I did. Or when I'm standing in front of Allah, I can stand as best as I can to say, Ya Rab, I tried to do what you wanted me to do. Because it's just dunya at the end of the day, and people want to fight over it. Let them fight over it, right? Like, leave behind what you can, because it's really going to be what's going to emphasize what you're taking with you. And that's where I think that order is also important, that if you're not hearing people say that they're grateful for what you do and the sacrifices that you've made, like, we are grateful for you and we do appreciate the things that you do. And even if no one else is seeing it, Allah is seeing it. And you need to see yourself in the way that He sees you, so that you keep kind of doing the amazing things that you're doing, inshallah, and be that source of real light and illumination for people at a time where things just feel really heavy right now.
I mean, beautifully said, and I really appreciate the words. I mean, they touch me as just as much as they would touch anybody, and I ask Allah to bless you and bless your endeavors and bless all the amazing work you're doing, tremendous work. And I see in around the country, I know you're alhamdulillah, I think you're happy not to be traveling too much and spending some good time with the family. So I'm sure you're really happy with that, as am I. Where can people connect with you? How can people connect with you, support some of the work initiatives you're working on, and some of the things y'all are doing, either at an individual level or at an organizational level with IC?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on like different social media platforms. I don't really like it so much, but I use it. I think there's positives and negatives, but if I can ever help anyone with anything, I check all my own emails. You can email me through our Islamic Center's website, ICNYU.org. And, I'm happy to help in whatever way that I can, inshallah. But please don't hesitate in reaching out if there's things that I can be in touch with to help.
And we'll leave all your all of your social medias in the podcast notes. And Jazakallah khair, Brother Khalid. Really, really wonderful connecting with you. I think such amazing insights on your journey, some of the amazing work you're doing, and some really, really valuable lessons for myself and everybody that will be listening to this, inshallah ta'ala. We want to thank you all for listening again to another episode of the Oaktree Institute podcast. We hope that this was beneficial to you and your journey to Allah Azza wa Jalla and serving His creation. And we hope and pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla accepts from us our good. And inshallah ta'ala, we hope to see you in our next episode. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.